Okay, let's talk about superhero movies, Brendan, because The Flash did not do very well at the box
From
office.
what I understand, I hate using hyperbolic terms. You do as well, JD, right?
Mm,
But can we call this a box office disaster?
I think so. I
Yeah.
mean, they hyped this movie up as the best superhero movie, if not ever, since The Dark Knight. That was the conversation.
Yeah.
And James Gunn was raving it. Tom Cruise, they even had Tom Cruise say something about it, and maybe a few other celebrities that's slipping the mind here, but
Mm-hmm.
they hyped this movie up. And it's also interesting because, we talked about how Warner Brothers and Zaslav is just destroying everything with Warner Brothers. When he
Yeah.
came on, one of the first huge things he did was write off the Batgirl movie. Nope, we're done. We're
Yeah.
not, this movie is finished, but we're writing this off. And they could have done the same thing with The Flash, especially because they were bringing on James Gunn to reboot the DCEU. We're going to completely
Mm-hmm.
start fresh. We're going to have a Kevin Feige figure that can spearhead this campaign for us. And that's probably the right call.
Yeah.
However, the Flash falls under the previous regime,
The
the
DCEU, as it was called,
DCEU.
as opposed to the new DCU, as I think it's going to
Yes,
be called going forward.
but they didn't write it off. They said we're going full steam into this.
Yeah.
So and not only that, but they put some money behind it. They did market this movie, and I fully believe Warner Brothers thought they had something massive on their hands, perhaps
Mm-hmm.
historic.
Mm-hmm.
Not the case.
No. No,
Not
not at
in
all.
terms, and like that's not. This isn't one of those situations where it didn't do well at the box office, but in time, history will be. No, I don't think history is going to be kind to
I
that
don't think
movie.
so. Well, and even so, like there's so much bad buzz around the production of this movie.
Yeah,
Most notably, the issues regarding Ezra Miller and their troubles that they're now trying to seek help for.
yeah,
But that certainly did not help. So I mean, the Flash
mhm,
is certainly a unique outlier in this in some ways because it had so much bad blood behind it.
mhm,
But then it's also the timing of it all. I think there's also a lot of reason to speculate that these same issues also permeated throughout Shazam 2 and Black Adam because we knew going into those movies that there was going to be a reset, right?
yeah, yeah,
That these movies didn't necessarily matter in the long run. And the movies that we saw, at least from our perspective, they felt like obligations. Like they felt
yeah,
like obligatory films. And I think people felt that as well, which is why they just didn't get the word of mouth to carry more box
yeah,
office momentum. And I think
mhm,
The Flash falls into that same category, just with more bad blood behind it, as we've been talking about. So there's definitely some circumstance there. It makes us question whether the announcement of this new James Gunn, Peter Safran led DCU, if the timing of it was really the right call.
mhm.
And maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I don't know, but I think that definitely plays a part of it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think a lot of this conversation echoes what we just talked about with Pixar in the
I
sense
agree.
that we live in a post COVID world now where things aren't the same as they were previously. Then you couple that with superhero fatigue. It's
Yeah,
expensive to go to the theaters, everything that we talked about before. And the other hurdle for DC especially is the lack of quality and the lack of consistency.
yep,
The one thing that Marvel has going for it is that they took their time, they built this universe. The movies have been varying forms of good. A few of them have even been great.
mm-hmm,
They concluded Endgame on a really high note.
yep,
So as they entered into phase 4, they had built up cachet.
Yeah.
So even as fatigue had set in, we all went through COVID and everything that comes along with that. And you look at the box office numbers of Phase 4, and Black Widow did the least at 379 million, which is pretty low
Yeah.
for Marvel. Eternals right there, 402 million. Not terrible, not great, but certainly not as bad as something like The Flash.
Yeah.
However, No Way Home, $1 billion.
Yep.
Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, almost $1 billion.
Yeah.
Thor: Love and Thunder, one of Marvel's worst, if you ask me, still was around $800 million. Like, it still did very well.
Yeah.
And Wakanda Forever did very well as well. And then Quantumania, it wasn't super great. Guardians, Volume 3 did very well though.
Yeah.
So despite the quality of Phase 4 and the beginning of Phase 5, and we can debate that.
Yeah.
I really liked Phase 4. I think there's potential with Phase 5, and we don't necessarily have to get into all those reasons right now. But
Right.
in terms of box office and superhero fatigue, the one thing Marvel has for it is that built-in cachet. They had earned that cachet.
They have a foundation already.
They have a foundation. As we all know, this isn't news. This isn't a new idea. Warner Brothers and DC was like, we're way behind here. We're jumping the gun. And we're going right in. So Man of Steel comes out, which it does well. And then their next movie was Batman versus Superman.
Yeah.
So,
Which sometimes I think they only made that movie just to have a great announcement for it at Hall H Comic Con. Because I remember hearing the word of mouth of just how bonkers that day was when that announcement was made. And it built up a lot of hype. Of course, I don't think the film lives up to that hype, and I think a lot of people might agree. No, I don't know if a lot of people might agree. A lot of people are very there are some people that love that movie, but I feel like they were DC and Warner Brothers. They were trying to play the hype game as opposed to the movie game, which is what Marvel was at least doing.
Yeah,
and they were going backwards. They were very regressive in that regard, and that's unfortunate.
I agree, and because of how they were rushing, when you get to something like Justice League, not only are you having to bring all these characters together for this global catastrophe, the stakes are high, yada yada, but in doing so, you have to, like, two of your characters are introduced in that film, so you're having to give us exposition and like an origin story for two of them in the middle of. That's something the Avengers movies never had to do.
And even when they did do it, it's all about how well you do it, right?
Yeah, execution.
Yeah, because like it's not an Avengers movie, but let's look at Captain America: Civil War, which in some ways is kind of Avengers 2.5, if you really want to think of it that way. But that introduced both Spider-Man and Black Panther without real like origin stories to define them. And yet I feel like by the end of Civil War, I started to get to know them enough to be compelled to see them more, right?
Yeah.
There was an efficiency.
I agree.
There.
No, I agree. That's
what DC did not have.
I agree. Now, to be fair, Justice League was marred by tragedy.
That was a very troubled production. So
it was a troubled production. However, regardless of what happened to Zack Snyder, and my heart still goes out to him for sure.
Yeah.
But the idea on paper, I think is still very flawed. When you're introducing two characters and giving them origin stories in the Justice League movie, like, he was up against the wall to begin with. And then with Zack Snyder's Justice League, now I think that's actually a pretty good movie on the whole. However, that's a 4-hour movie. Like that wouldn't have been released in theaters as it was.
No,
they would have, even if that was his vision, they still would have asked him to cut it to at least 3 hours, which means that all of the depth of that film in terms of introducing those characters, and I do think Cyborg and Zack Snyder's Justice League is actually kind of fascinating. Like, but all of that still would have been cut out in the theatrical cut.
Yeah.
So, like, the approach, I just think is fundamentally flawed. and then the execution just wasn't there.
Agreed.
And so when you get to where we enter into COVID with Birds of Prey made 205 million still. That's a movie that I think without COVID
I
probably
think
would
that
have
would have
done
done
well.
better. I think that
That
could
would have
have
done
been
well, to be
that
fair.
could I think that
Yeah,
would have been at least 500 million,
I
or somewhere
agree.
around that range.
I'm also curious about Wonder Woman 1984. And again, we can argue quality all day long, but that first
I
movie
still
did
really like that movie.
the first one did well, that if it didn't come out in 2020, would that have done well financially more than it
Yeah,
did?
yeah,
I think there's an argument to be made there, but still,
yeah.
regardless, those haven't performed up to the standards of what we saw with Marvel. And then the Suicide Squad didn't do super great either. Again, quality. I'm not arguing quality. Black Adam was a huge failure. Shazam!
Hmm.
Fury of the Gods did almost nothing as well at the box office, and then now with
Yeah.
the Flash. And I think those three films are simply a result of people not responding to those films because the quality is just really bad.
It's that foundational support that it just doesn't have that we keep talking about. And like we alluded to, the knowledge that a lot of this is not going to matter, which is why of the remaining DC films that we have at least this year before we kickstart James Gunn and Peter Safran's DCU. What do we have? We have technically it's just Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, right? Because from what I
Mhm.
understand, Blue Beetle is the first character of the newly dubbed DCU.
Mhm.
I don't think enough people know that, but I wouldn't be surprised if out of all of these DC movies that we've gotten over the past year or so, Blue Beetle is the one that ends up being the most financially successful. And
I'm
I
gonna be
think
curious. Yeah.
it's because it looks different. Like there's a
Yeah.
difference to it. Like I have a hunch that regardless if it's a good movie or not, I love the first Aquaman. I think it's my favorite of the whole DCEU. I think that sequel, I think what comes out in December, if I'm not mistaken.
Mhm.
I think it's going to fail financially. I just don't see it doing very well. Just given the history of what we're leading up to.
Yeah, I mean, you might be right. Blue Beetle, I think, is fascinating because it
Hmm.
has the potential, and I'm not as familiar with DC as I am with Marvel,
Hmm.
but I kind of wonder if it has the potential to be their Iron Man, right? Because
Yeah.
Iron Man in 2008, like, he was not one of Marvel's most prominent, characters. Like, you
No.
go on the streets and you ask people then about Marvel, and it would have been Spider Man, X Men, Fantastic Four, Captain
Yeah.
America. Like, those
Yeah.
would have been the characters that they talked about. Iron Man was like in the B tier. Like,
Yeah. He
he was
wasn't for
not
me.
in
He
that
was
A
one I
tier.
loved as a kid, but you're
Yeah.
right.
Oh, I did
Yeah.
too. But like
Yeah.
broadly speaking, he was more in that second tier.
Yeah. You're
And
right.
then it comes out, and is there anyone that is more of a face of the MCU than Tony Stark and
No.
Robert Downey Jr.?
No, who would have expected that? I don't even think
Who?
Marvel expected that. I mean,
No
Marvel
way they
Studios came about
anticipated that.
because of the success of
Yeah,
Iron Man.
yeah, and so I say that to say that Blue Beetle might not be Batman or Superman or Wonder Woman or even Aquaman. People
Hmm.
might not know the character. I certainly don't know much about the character, but maybe if it's done well and it's good, and then over the course of time, how they utilize that character, maybe it could have some sort of similar trajectory.
Yeah.
Uh, and that to me is the excitement of where James Gunn might be taking all of this. But
Yeah. Yeah.
again,
And I'd
they
be
have
curious to
to
see
earn
what
it though.
happens.
They have to build their way.
I trust James Gunn knows what he's doing to build it. I think the problem now is that they have all this baggage that needs to come out first in order to pave the way for what new things we're going to see. I mean, as we're recording this, we only now just saw the news of who has been cast as both Clark Kent and Lois Lane in Superman
Yes. Yeah.
Legacy.
Yeah.
Very good casting choices. I might add. I think they seem
Mhm.
very well cast. I'm excited to see what they're going to do with their respective roles. But once the baggage is gone, I feel like is when we can literally wipe that slate clean and start anew. We've just got these obligations to clear the way
Mhm.
for it. But I think people are recognizing that, which is why these movies haven't been
Mhm.
doing very well, because they know that they're just obligations.
Yeah, and that leads me to my next point, and I sent out a tweet about this last week, and I got some
Hmm.
pushback about it as far as quality. Like, I'm of the mindset of make good movies.
Yeah.
Make good movies and people will go and see them. Now, it's of course not that black and white. There are so many factors at play. I recognize that. We've talked a lot about them, and
Hmm.
because of the comfortability of being at home on your couch, comfortably in your sweatpants and your 90-inch TV and your surround sound,
Yeah.
maybe you'd rather watch The Flash in that way, or the new Mission Impossible, or whatever the movie is.
Oh
You know,
gosh.
maybe that's how you prefer it. So I understand that there are factors at play. However, I think quality in a post-COVID world matters more now than it ever did before.
Oh, I agree.
Now,
I mean, look at Top Gun Maverick. Look
well,
at
that's one of the examples that I was going to bring up. Top Gun Maverick makes 1.5 billion dollars. Now, Top Gun is a beloved movie, I would say,
yeah,
but we're
yeah,
talking about a sequel to a movie from what, 1986.
yeah,
That film had no right to make 1.5 billion dollars. But the
yeah,
reason it does is because it's really good, it's emotionally involved, and people went to see it more than once because of that.
yeah.
That's
That
how you get to 1.5 billion.
This is how we have to do this analysis, right? Is that it's so hard to do because you can't tell who's seeing movies multiple times, right? There's just no way to track that
Mhm.
kind of detail in that granular of a
Yeah.
way. But in the case of movies like Top Gun Maverick, you could potentially see this like growing escalation in box office numbers as the weeks go on, and not just in its infancy, right? And that's
Uh-huh.
where the word of mouth becomes very important in leading to good box office results. Like, let's say we go back to something like The Flash, for instance, which we've called a box office disaster. I don't think that's a hyperbole. The movie is
Yeah.
doing terrible numbers
So
at the
bad.
box office.
Yeah.
But let's say hypothetically, the hype that that movie was getting about it being the quote unquote greatest superhero movie ever made, let's say that those were true and most people felt that way about the movie. Would the numbers be different? And I kind of think they would. I think they're yeah,
I think now, when you consider, again, not just home theater comfortability, but the cost of going to the theater.
yeah.
And
It has to feel like
just,
there's this event that we're going to the movies for.
yeah, I mean, people are saving their money. It's simply why there isn't as many comedies anymore, which is why I'm
Yeah,
really hoping the Jennifer Lawrence movie does well, because we don't
yeah,
get R-rated comedies in theaters anymore. Those go straight to
yeah.
Netflix these days. You know, if you're not a horror film, if you're not a superhero movie,
Hmm.
the chances of you going to theaters are getting slimmer and slimmer.
Yeah.
You know, the $50 million adult drama just doesn't exist anymore,
Hmm.
unless a Scorsese is funding it
Yeah.
and producing it or directing it, or unless you're a significant name, it's really hard to get those movies into
Yeah.
theaters.
Yeah.
It is these big IP movies, you know, that people are saving their money up for. And so, you know, when it comes uh to getting people into the movie, like there's such a competition factor when you consider not just the streaming, not just the at home stuff, but you know, everything that comes with the technology we have now. Everything is demanding your attention at every
Yeah.
second.
Yeah.
That to get people in the theaters, it has to be some sort of quote unquote event.
Yeah.
And that's why I think quality will matter now more than ever, because
Hmm.
it will get people excited for these movies. And then the word of mouth, I do think, is again more important now in a post-COVID world than it ever was previously.
Yep.
Because to your point, if The Flash was great, if it genuinely lived up to the hype, people would have seen it. They would
Yep.
have raved about it. They would have told their friends, and the people that were on the fence would have gone to see that movie and
Yeah.
maybe saw it multiple times.
Yeah.
And then that's how you get to $1 billion. Now, I just think everything post COVID is so different than it was before that I don't think we can compare what going to the movies is now to what it was in 2019, which is why for me, the notion of just make good movies and people will show up, I know there's nuance to it, but I think that matters so much right now. And Top
Yeah.
Gun Maverick has proven this.
Well-
Avatar: The Way of Water has proven this. Hell, even if we want to go to the world of DC, the Batman proved that, right? That made
Batman
almost
proved it.
$800 million worldwide, which blew everything DCEU out of the water
and I
in the same
hate-
time frame.
I hate to keep making these comparisons because there is this consistent narrative among film critics about what blockbuster filmmaking used to be as opposed to what it is now. But let's look at the early to mid 2000s, right? A very different time, but we've often talked about that was a time when filmmakers were given the reins to make blockbusters and still make their own movies, right? And that's why movies like, let's say, Spider-Man or Spider-Man 2 or Pirates of the Caribbean or some of those Harry Potter films, The Lord of the Rings and whatnot, they felt like events. Now, not all movies have to do that, but there was a very different approach to movie making that went into blockbuster filmmaking, that it was still, it was this balance between commercial business and art. Like they were working congruently. It was a parallel business model. Now it's perpendicular. And that's maybe that's inherently the problem, that it starts to create this sense of repetition when you notice one way over the other. And that's kind of a sad notion too, because if a lot of these movies were looking back at how blockbusters used to be made, I think there could be more of a sense of excitement for them, even if you don't know why you should be excited for them. You're right. Just make good movies. People will talk about them then.
Yeah, I think that's what a lot of this comes down to, at least now. And again, it's not mutually exclusive.
No.
Because you have something like Jurassic World Dominion make $1 billion, and that's not the greatest of movies. So look, these average movies, these below average, not very good IP blockbusters, look, some of them will trickle in, but that comes from a franchise where people have always shown up to see those movies.
Yep.
So it has that built-in fan base. But even if you look at something like Fast X, for example, and perhaps this plays into the fatigue we talked about earlier and all these other exterior factors. So far, that movie has made $689 million worldwide, comparatively to Fast 9, which did 750. And then you look at The Fate of the Furious, so the eighth movie, which did 1.2 billion. So again,
there's definitely diminishing returns.
There's diminishing returns. And part of that, I think, is the quality since 7 hasn't quite been there, and we're now seeing the effects of that. You know, whereas you look at something like John Wick 4. So John Wick 3, for context, that did 327 million, and that was 2019, so that's pre-COVID.
Yeah.
John Wick 4 did 427 million worldwide.
Yeah.
So
it's also a much longer movie.
Yeah, exactly.
Nearly 3-hour movie too. Let's put that in perspective.
So yeah, exactly. So and that film does well because of quality. It's good, and people went to see it. They told their friends, and so those that are invested in that franchise or in that kind of movie, they certainly went to see it. So you do see that, like, the trajectory of that has gone upwards.
Yeah.
And is it a coincidence that those films are well made? I don't know, but it's interesting to see that, and especially with Avatar and Top Gun Maverick.
Yeah.
And again, I understand that there's variances here, there are shades of gray and all of this. But the films at the tip of the spear that are doing gangbusters at the box office post-COVID, that is very important. I'm not talking about anything pre-COVID,
no,
but everything post-COVID. It all comes down to quality and being distinctive, and it's not CGI soup. Like those kind of movies, even my beloved Transformers. I love the Transformers franchise. We talked about this when we did our Transformers review here on the show. Like as much as I enjoyed Rise of the Beast, visually speaking, quality wise, like, say what you will about Michael Bay, but those films have a tangibility to them. Like there's like there's something about them that feels lived in. And I think the animation and the CGI is honestly still very good. It's a little clunkier, but it's cleaner.
Clunky, but,
like
but there's at
it's
least
sharp.
there's a vibrancy at least.
Yeah.
Like you could definitely sense that there's an attempt to put into the saturation to at least enlighten some of the color palettes and make it kind of lush and vivid where it needs to be.
Exactly. And we just don't like. I want the new Transformers to do well, but I understand why it hasn't garnered the response that it has. And, if some of this is also on Michael Bay because those last two Transformers movies were not very good. And so similarly to DC, I think people have become tired of Transformers and they're not nearly as invested in that franchise anymore.
And sadly, Bumblebee wasn't enough to bring them back in.
No, and that's where again there's various shades of gray here because that's a good movie that mostly got good reviews. People tend to really like it. The word of mouth though wasn't nearly as strong. People didn't really quite go to see it. So look, it's not it's not black and white, but
right.
Generally speaking, I think especially now, and Bumblebee was pre-COVID. So again, I think that is somewhat excluded from this conversation.
Right.
I kind of wonder how that film would do now, honestly, in a post-COVID world.
Yeah.
But
it's a good point. Be curious.
Now, make good movies, people will go.
And
unless it's horror, then it's a different story.
Well, I mean, horror tends to always make its money back because they're always made on the cheap anyway.
People love you
can do whatever you want with that genre, but just make good movies. Honestly, just selfishly speaking, we just want to see good movies. So
that's it too. That's the funny thing about the pushback more than anything else is like,
people need to debate on film Twitter, right? I mean, it's like you can agree with a point, but you got to find some little thing that you can push back on just for the sake of being confrontational because it's just easy to do that in an online forum, and that's. That's
I'm not calling anyone out specifically. I just think it's funny that my whole thing was make good movies, people will show up, and I was getting pushback to go, nah, that's not it. That's not good enough. It's like I just want there to be good movies. Like just do it.
And I don't just say it as the royal we. I'm saying like, you and I just want to see good movies, and we want to be surprised and blown away by something that feels like it could be an event. That's what we go to the movies for. That sensation, that otherworldly aspect that they can bring out.
I agree. Looking at the box office here, though, Brennan, I want to somewhat flip the script here a little bit. I want to go back to animation here for a quick moment because earlier with Pixar, we were talking about marketing. The Super Mario Brothers movie has done $1.3 billion worldwide.
It's the highest grossing animated movie of all time, right?
Yes.
Or no, not of all time. It is certain. Yeah, it's. I think it's in the top 3 right now. Again,
close.
Listeners, correct me if I'm wrong, but I know it's up there pretty highly, at least in the top 5 of all time.
So, and obviously with Elemental coming out this year, like coming out in the same year, like it to me that is, it reverberates that there's really no excuse from Disney and Pixar. And I think a lot of this comes down to, and it's hard to compare. This is not apples to apples because Elemental isn't relying on IP.
No.
If anything, it's reliant on a certain Pixar mentality, but the Super Mario Brothers has tons of nostalgia behind it. However, I will say this, if you remove the nostalgia, the marketing for that film was way better than what we've seen from Pixar recently.
That's the thing. It's a different audience for one thing, between Illumination and Pixar specifically.
Oh, for
right?
sure.
But say what you will about Illumination. I don't love many of their movies, okay? But they know how to market the shit out of their movies because they know exactly who they're targeting and they target them well. And those are
Yeah.
younger kids.
Yeah.
These are young kids that they are feeding into the mindset of. And I have to give them credit for doing that very well. Like they may not
Yeah.
make the best quality movies, in my opinion, but I think they're some of the best movie marketers in the animated world nowadays.
Yeah.
They know how to target. They do a really good job at it.
Well, and that's the thing with the Minions movies and Super
Mhm.
Mario Brothers.
Secret Life
Look,
of Pets were also that was a
yeah,
big hit too, if I'm not mistaken.
absolutely. And you're right that they know what their audience is, and the movies themselves are mindful of that as well
Yeah.
because those movies and quality wise, it's certainly why I adore Pixar more because the Illumination movies are pretty formulaic and a bit
Mhm.
childish, but that's why families love them.
Yeah.
Where Pixar, like Elemental, is this mature allegory about immigration. Look, my 7 year old could not comprehend that, let alone even younger kids than
Sure.
that who can go into Super Mario Brothers movie and love that. Like, and my son saw that as well and loved it. Like he loved Super Mario Brothers.
Mhm.
So and he likes a lot of the Minions movies as well. So like those movies, say what you will about them, they know what they're who they're making this for,
Yep.
and they're not trying to be Pixar. And they certainly deserve credit for that.
Yeah, they
And
do.
and to your point, they know how to market those movies accordingly.
They do. Yeah.
And look, I love that Pixar isn't trying to lower their threshold in terms
No,
of their
they're not
artistic
pandering
values.
to a different audience because they know there might be more money in it. But that's the thing. If you know what your audience is and you know what that mindset is, it changes how you market that specific film to that audience. And
Mhm.
I think if anything, if we want to try and broaden this observation, Pixar, I think, just hasn't done as good of a job at that type of, outbound marketing, that type of
Yeah.
targeting that Illumination is very good at. It'd be a very different strategy, but it's how you go about feeding into that specific mindset and that audience, which I think Pixar has just been kind of hit or miss on.
I agree. No, I very much agree. Before we transition, do you have any other thoughts on the current state of cinema as it is?
July, I think it's in July. Don't we see another Criterion sale of Barnes and Noble coming up? So if
Yeah.
there's any message here, buy physical media, buy Criterion. They have some pretty good movies, if I do say so myself.
Yeah. No, it's that and that's another interesting thing about where we are right now. And I don't know what the future is in terms of not just awards movies, but like these small indies. Like earlier this year, I thought it was promising that I had to go see Showing Up in a theater.
Yeah.
It was exciting. I got to see Asteroid City and Past Lives in a theater.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't with the box office the way that it is with superhero movies, even not doing well, Pixar not doing well. I don't think theaters are going away anytime soon. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to make this like the bleakest point I've ever made here on the show.
No, no.
But I am curious what the next few years are going to look like. Is it simply an indication that there's superhero fatigue and these movies aren't very good and people just don't care anymore? I'm hoping it's more that. I'm hoping that it's just Pixar, being a
Just
victim of
segmented to
the
these to either this subgenre or this studio or something.
yeah, or Pixar being a victim of Lucas' success
Yeah.
and people being conditioned to watching things at home. I guess I'm hoping it's that and hoping that maybe we can burst out of that bubble a little bit because you know, like watching a midnight special in theaters, like that was a small movie in 2016. And like I
That was like
remember
a
that
religious experience
it
for you, wasn't
was
it?
absolutely like this religious spiritual experience. Like I would love to
Yeah.
have more
Of
of those
those.
experiences.
Yeah.
Not that I can't have them at home. I certainly have,
No.
but
Yeah.
there's something about going to the theater that, I guess if we're going to keep this on religion, like it is my church, so to
It kind
speak.
of
Like
is.
it's
Yeah.
like that's kind of
And
where I go to
and there's
have
nothing
those.
and there's nothing like seeing a new movie for the first time in that setting and it blows you away, like, let's say, a Midnight Special or First Man did for you, or
Yeah.
like a Petite Maman did for me.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
or like the Tale of the Princess Kaguya when I saw that back in 2014, and I was
Yeah.
like, "This is one of the greatest movies I've ever seen." Not to say that every year needs a movie of that caliber to do that to you, but every year there are movies that at least come close that move you in a new and invigorating way that still
Mhm.
respects and appreciates the art itself and the
Yeah.
preservation of it. And
Yeah.
that's the church aspect that we always talk
Yeah.
about with this.
For sure. Which is to say, going back to just make good movies,
Yeah.
hopefully, through like the past lives and the asteroid cities and, the midnight specials of the world, hopefully we'll be able to kind of, keep those in theaters,
Yeah.
moving forward. Cause I certainly want to be able to have those experiences. I just don't
Yeah.
want it to become IP.
Yeah.
And who knows, maybe the failures of a lot of these IP films we've seen recently, and maybe it'll give way for some of these lower tier budget movies to kind of make their way into theaters.
One
Who
can
knows?
only hope that maybe there is a positive ripple effect that could occur from all of this. I don't know
Mm.
if it were to happen. It still seems too soon to tell, but maybe we can look back on this and think, oh man, all those complaints that we had about these movies and these big budget movies not being very good and doing terrible numbers. Aren't you glad that that happened to lead to it? Like
Yeah.
maybe it'll be one of those conversations we have in, I don't know, 10 years or so.
Yeah. I agree. The last thought I have on this, and then we can transition here. I As much as I have enjoyed the Marvel machine, and
Mhm.
I'm looking forward to what James Gunn might have up his sleeve, I would love to get back to a world where there's a little bit more priority on art and not executives, you know, with greed in their eyes, just kind of strumming their
Mhm.
fingers and asking these things to be out, every single year because
Yeah.
you know, I mentioned Michael Bay earlier and his visual eye, or even something like, of course, there's like Lord of the Rings as another great example, or how about Pirates of the Caribbean?
Yeah.
Like
I brought that up
the
too.
practical and even the CGI, the CGI of those films, and we're talking about 20 years ago now, and the CGI of those films is
Looks better than anything
remarkably
today.
better.
Yeah.
Yes, because
Davy Jones is one of the greatest digital creations I have
yeah,
ever seen put to screen.
I agree. And how often do we hear the visual artists, you know, that are working in Hollywood talking about how they are being worked to death because
Yeah.
of all these superhero movies? Like, you know, like I thought that first Iron Man actually looked really good. They took their time with
The
that.
majority of phase 1, I think, looks
Yeah,
amazing.
it looks really good. Like
Yeah.
you can certainly tell like phase 1, phase 2, like they were taking their time, and it's not until like these like recent years where it's become CGI soup. Same thing
Yeah.
with DC and even outside of superhero movies, just a lot of blockbusters we get to these days. Transformers, Rise of the Beast. I mentioned like all of them fall into these flat
Yeah.
visuals that are insipid
And
and
it's because they're probably working on all these same movies. They work
yes,
for these companies that are contracted by these studios to work on their respective films, and if they're double dipping like this all the time, at the rate that these movies are coming out, they just can't balance that workload.
they can't, and I would like to kind of get back to the way things looked with like Pirates of the Caribbean, for example.
Mhm.
Which is why I admire James Cameron coming out and going, you know what? We're pushing all of these movies back 3 years.
Yeah. Yep.
You know, Avatar 5 is coming out in 2031.
That's incredible. That's insane. Oh my
Just
gosh.
could you like? I can't even imagine like in 2031 doing a press tour for something you filmed 14 years ago. Like,
That is oh my god, that's almost our ages right now between the first Avatar and Avatar 5 then.
yeah,
That's
wild.
insane. That's I mean, well, it's younger than us, and we're in our 30s, but that's what 2009 to 2031. That's 22 years. So
Yeah,
it's
it's insane.
it's a full
And
that's a full youthful lifetime. It's
yeah,
insane.
yeah, and I respect that Goat Cameron is like, look, I need time to get this right, and he delivers. He certainly delivers, and you know, no one batted an eye when that came out, other than it was
No.
like, okay, this is funny, but everyone's like, let him cook. You know,
We
that's
trust
what we want.
Cameron. We talk about Illumination knowing how to market their movies. Cameron knows how to market a movie. Like I don't
Yeah.
know how he does it or what his strategy is, but somehow his movies just feed into the mindset of people who like going to the movies and are curious, and they're going to see his work regardless if it's like 17 hours
Mhm.
long. It just
Mhm.
it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I agree. You know, and look, I'm still looking forward to what Marvel and DC and all these other, you know, if they continue Transformers. You know, a
Yeah.
film isn't entirely predicated on its visuals. It can still have great characters and performances and
Yep.
thematic nuances to it that's still really great. But it is a visual medium. You can't completely separate the craft, the artistic visual craft from what we're seeing on screen. And, you know,
Right.
Maverick and The Batman, The Way of Water, like all of these films are indicative of what you can do to, you know, take cinema to a new level. And people right now, post COVID, are responding to that.
They are. Yeah.
So I guess essentially that's my main point, what I was
Yeah.
trying to get at earlier.
I think that's fair.